Historians scan group photo from 1905, then enhance a shadowy figure and call authorities. The dust particles danced in the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows of the East Fall Historical Institute's archive room. Dr. Lila Monroe adjusted her reading glasses and carefully lifted another photograph from the weathered cardboard box labeled Raven Rock Mining Company 1905. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten memories filled her nostrils as she examined each image with the methodical precision that had made her Oregon's most respected historian of industrial-era America. Lila had always found solace in the quiet corners of history. While her colleagues chased after glamorous Revolutionary War artifacts battlefields, she preferred the overlooked stories of ordinary people who built America's industrial backbone. Coal miners, factory workers, railroad builders, their faces stared back at her from faded photographs, each one a window into a world that had vanished long before she was born. The current collection had been donated by the estate of Harold Blackwood, the last surviving member of a family that once owned several mining operations across the Pacific Northwest. Most of the photographs were standard company portraits and equipment documentation, the kind of mundane corporate records that rarely interested anyone except dedicated researchers like herself. She was halfway through the box when her fingers found it, a group photograph larger than the others, mounted on thick cardboard that had yellowed with age. The image showed roughly 30 men posed in 3 rows outside what appeared to be the main entrance to a mine shaft. They wore the typical uniform of early 1900s miners, dark wool trousers, suspenders, and caps pulled low over weathered faces. Some held pickaxes and shovels, others simply stood with their arms crossed, their expressions serious and dignified despite the grime that covered their work clothes. What made this photograph different was the handwritten notation on the back. Raven Rock Mine Final Crew Photo, October 15, 1905. 3 weeks before the collapse. Lila felt a familiar chill run down her spine. She knew about the Raven Rock disaster, of course. It was one of the worst mining accidents in Oregon history, a catastrophic cave-in that had finished 40 workers and effectively ended large-scale mining operations in the region. The cause had never been fully determined, though official reports blamed it on unstable geological conditions and inadequate safety measures. She turned the photograph over and studied the faces more carefully. These men had no idea they were living their final weeks. They posed with the quiet confidence of workers who trusted their skills and their equipment, unaware that the mountain above them was already shifting, already preparing to claim their lives. As she prepared to scan the image into her digital archive, something in the background caught her attention. Behind the main group of miners, partially obscured by shadows and the natural blur that came with the long exposure times of early photography, stood another figure. At first glance, he appeared to be just another worker who had happened to be passing by when the photograph was taken. But something about his positioning seemed deliberate, as if he had intentionally placed himself at the edge of the frame. Lila squinted at the figure, trying to make out more details. The image quality was poor, typical of photographs from that era, but there was something oddly distinct about this person compared to the other blurred background elements. She reached for her magnifying glass, but even with enhanced viewing, the figure remained frustratingly unclear. That's when she remembered the new AI enhancement software the Institute had recently purchased. The technology could analyze old photographs and sharpen details that were invisible to the naked eye, revealing information that had been hidden for decades. She had used it successfully on several occasions to identify previously unknown individuals in historical images. Lila carefully placed the photograph on the high-resolution scanner and imported the digital file into her computer. The enhancement software took several minutes to process the image, analyzing pixel patterns and reconstructing details based on sophisticated algorithms. She made herself a cup of tea while she waited, her mind already wandering to other photographs in the collection. When she returned to her desk, the enhanced image was ready. She opened the file and immediately zoomed in on the background figure that had caught her attention. Her teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. The enhanced image revealed details that should have been impossible. The man in the background, now clearly visible, was wearing what appeared to be a modern digital wristwatch on his left wrist. The metallic band caught the light in a way that was unmistakable, and she could even make out what looked like a small digital display. Even more shocking, his clothing was completely wrong for the period. Instead of the rough wool and cotton garments worn by the miners, he wore what appeared to be a form-fitting suit with segmented padding, almost like modern tactical gear or protective clothing. But it was his face that truly unnerved her. Unlike the other figures in the photograph, who showed the natural slight blurring that came with movement during long exposures, his features were perfectly sharp and clear. He stared directly at the camera with an expression that seemed almost knowing, as if he was aware that someone, someday, would enhance this image and discover him. Lila stared at the screen for several long minutes, her mind racing through possible explanations. Could someone have manipulated the photograph? But the image showed no signs of digital alteration, and the original was clearly authentic. The paper, the mounting, the handwriting on the back all matched the period perfectly. Could it be some kind of early photographic experiment, or unusual clothing that only appeared modern to contemporary eyes? She zoomed out and examined the rest of the photograph again. Everything else was exactly as it should be for 1905. The miners' clothing, their tools, even the wooden structures visible in the background all matched historical records perfectly. Only this one figure seemed out of place, as if he had somehow stepped into the frame from another time entirely. The rational part of her mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the enhancement software had somehow corrupted the image, creating false details that weren't actually present in the original. But when she compared the enhanced version to the original scan, she could see that the software had only clarified what was already there. It hadn't added anything new. As the afternoon shadows grew longer across the archive room floor, Lila found herself unable to look away from the mysterious figure. There was something compelling about his presence in the photograph, something that suggested he belonged there despite being completely out of place. He wasn't hiding or trying to avoid the camera, quite the opposite. He seemed to be deliberately positioning himself to be noticed, but only by someone who took the time to look carefully. She printed out both the original and enhanced versions of the photograph and pinned them to the corkboard above her desk. Tomorrow, she would begin researching the image more thoroughly. She would contact other historians, check archives for similar anomalies, and try to find a rational explanation for what she was seeing. But deep in her heart, as she gathered her things and prepared to leave for the day, Lila Monroe suspected that she had stumbled upon something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about history, time, and the nature of recorded truth. The man in the photograph seemed to be waiting for her, watching her across more than a century with eyes that held secrets she was only beginning to imagine. The last rays of sunlight faded from the archive room as she locked the door behind her, leaving the mysterious watchman alone in the darkness with the ghosts of 40 deceased miners and the questions that would soon consume her life. 3 weeks had passed since Lila's discovery, and her desk had become a chaotic landscape of printouts, sticky notes, and open laptops. The university library's basement archives had become her second home, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as she worked through the night, cross-referencing every mining disaster, industrial accident, and construction project from the early 1900s she could find. What started as curiosity had transformed into an obsession that bordered on academic madness. Her colleagues had begun to whisper about her late-night research sessions and her increasingly disheveled appearance. But Lila couldn't stop. The watchman's face haunted her dreams, and she needed answers. Her breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night in the dusty archives of the Portland Historical Society. She was examining a collection of photographs from the 1907 San Francisco earthquake reconstruction when she saw him again. There, in the background of a group photo showing construction workers rebuilding a collapsed theater, stood the same figure. The same face, the same expression, the same impossible clothing. Her hands trembled as she held the magnifying glass closer to the image. It was definitely him, not just similar, but absolutely identical. "It can't be," she whispered to the empty archive room. But it was. Over the following days, her search expanded beyond Oregon, beyond the United States. She reached out to historical societies across the globe, sending carefully worded emails asking about unusual figures in early 20th century photographs. She never mentioned what she was really looking for, describing her research only as a study of recurring photographic subjects in industrial documentation. The responses that came back sent chills down her spine. From the Birmingham Industrial Heritage Society in England came a photograph of steel workers from 1903, taken just days before a factory fire that finished 23 people. The watchman was there, partially hidden behind a steam engine, but unmistakably present. A curator from the South African Mining Museum sent her an image from the Kimberley diamond mines, dated 1906. Another industrial disaster, another group of workers who had no idea what was coming. And there he was again, standing at the edge of the frame with that same knowing expression. The Canadian Pacific Railway archives provided the most disturbing image yet, a photograph of bridge construction workers in British Columbia from 1908. The bridge had collapsed 3 days after the photo was taken, sending a dozen men plummeting into the Fraser River. The watchman stood in the background, as if he had been waiting for the camera to capture the moment. Each photograph told the same impossible story. The figure never aged, never changed position, never altered his expression. It was as if the same person had somehow appeared at disaster sites across 3 continents over the span of more than a decade. Late one evening, while scrolling through an obscure academic forum dedicated to photographic anomalies, Lila found a thread started by someone named T. Varga from Prague. The post was titled, "Seeking Information, Recurring Figure in Historical Photography." Her heart raced as she read his message. "I am an archivist with the Czech National Archives. For years, I have noticed the same individual appearing in photographs from various European industrial sites, dating from 1890 to approximately 1920. The figure appears exclusively at locations that later experienced catastrophic accidents. I would be grateful to correspond with anyone who has observed similar phenomena." Lila's fingers flew across the keyboard as she composed her response. Within hours, she received a reply from Tomas Varga, who seemed as relieved as she was to find someone else who had noticed the pattern. Their email exchange over the following weeks revealed the full scope of what they were dealing with. Tomas had been documenting the watchman's appearances for over 15 years, collecting photographs from archives across Europe. His earliest confirmed sighting was from a coal mine in Wales, dated 1890. The mine had collapsed 4 days after the photograph was taken. "What disturbs me most," Tomas wrote in one email, "is not just his presence, but his consistency. In every photograph, he maintains the exact same pose, the same facial expression, even the same angle to the camera. It is as if time has no meaning for this individual." But the most chilling revelation came when Tomas mentioned that other researchers had noticed the pattern before them. "There was a photojournalist in the 1920s," he wrote, "who became obsessed with what he called the watchman. He documented dozens of appearances, kept detailed notes, developed theories. But his research drove him to madness, according to those who knew him. He disappeared in 1928, leaving behind only his journals and photographs." As Lila stared at her computer screen, surrounded by printed photographs and scattered notes, she felt the weight of something vast and unknowable pressing down on her. The watchman wasn't just an anomaly, he was a pattern, a constant presence at moments of human tragedy spanning decades and continents. The rational part of her mind still searched for logical explanations. Could it be an elaborate hoax perpetrated across multiple archives and countries? Some kind of early photographic technique that created similar artifacts? But the evidence was too consistent, too widespread, too precise to be explained away by conventional means. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the wall where she had pinned dozens of photographs, each one showing the same impossible figure. He was always there when disaster struck, always watching, always waiting. But waiting for what? Tomorrow, she decided, she would book a flight to Prague. Tomas had mentioned the missing photojournalist's diary, and she had to see it for herself. Whatever the watchman was, whatever his presence meant, the answers lay hidden in the past, and she was determined to find them, no matter where they led her. The taxi wound through Prague's narrow cobblestone streets, as morning fog clung to the ancient buildings. Lila pressed her face to the window, watching the city wake up around her. After 12 hours of travel and very little sleep, she felt disconnected from reality, a feeling that had become disturbingly familiar since discovering the Watchman. Tomas Varga's apartment building looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1940s. The elevator creaked ominously as it carried her to the 4th floor, where she found herself standing before a heavy wooden door marked only with the number 47. The man who answered her knock was nothing like she had imagined. Tomas was perhaps 70 years old, with wild white hair and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets. His apartment was a maze of towering bookshelves, filing cabinets, and wooden crates filled with photographs and documents. "Dr. Monroe," he said in accented English, extending a weathered hand. "I am grateful you came. Very few people would travel so far for what others consider madness." As he led her through the cluttered space, Lila noticed that the walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, arranged in chronological order. She recognized many from her own research, but there were dozens more she had never seen. 43 confirmed appearances, Tomas said, noticing her gaze. From 1890 to 1923. Always the same face, always the same pose. Always disaster follows within days. He cleared a stack of books from a worn leather armchair and gestured for her to sit. "But you did not come here to see my collection. You came for this." From a locked wooden chest, he withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was embossed with the name, Victor Cerny, in faded gold lettering. Victor was a photojournalist, Tomas explained, handling the diary with reverence. He worked for newspapers across Europe in the 1920s. He was the first to notice the pattern, the first to give the figure a name. He called him the Watchman. Lila accepted the diary with trembling hands. The leather was soft and worn from years of handling, and when she opened it, the musty smell of old paper filled her nostrils. Victor's handwriting was precise but increasingly frantic as the entries progressed. "Read aloud," Tomas requested. "I have memorized much of it, but I still find new meanings in his words." Lila began reading from an entry dated March 15, 1926. "I have found him again. This time in a photograph from the Donbass coal mine disaster in Ukraine. 17 finished, as always. He stands in the exact same position, wearing those impossible clothes. I have studied photography for 20 years, and I know this is not a trick of light or shadow. This is something else entirely." She flipped through several pages, each entry more desperate than the last. Victor had traveled across Europe, collecting photographs and testimonies, trying to understand what he was seeing. "Here," Tomas said, pointing to an entry from August 1927. "Read this one. I spoke today with an old woman in Romania whose grandfather was a photographer in the 1890s. She remembered him talking about the man who watches the dying. Her grandfather believed he was not human, not evil, simply different. A witness to events that must happen. She used a phrase that haunts me. He records the irreversible." Lila looked up at Tomas. "What does that mean?" The old archivist's expression was grave. "Victor developed a theory. He believed the Watchman was not causing these disasters, he was documenting them. Like how do you say, a clerk of fate. Present only when certain events were fixed in time, unchangeable." She continued reading. Victor's entries became increasingly philosophical, filled with questions about destiny, free will, and the nature of time itself. But they also became more paranoid. "January 3, 1928. I cannot sleep. I see his face everywhere, in crowds, in mirrors, in my dreams. Others who have investigated him too deeply speak of the same thing. There is a cost to seeing too clearly. The mind was not meant to comprehend such things." "What happened to him?" Lila asked. Tomas walked to the window and gazed out at the Prague skyline. "He disappeared in March 1928. Left everything behind, his apartment, his photographs, his research. Some say he went mad. Others believe he found something he was not meant to find." He returned to the chest and withdrew a sealed envelope. But before he vanished, he left this. A letter marked for the next to see. Lila stared at the envelope, her heart pounding. The paper was yellow with age, and Victor's careful handwriting on the front seemed to glow in the afternoon light streaming through the dusty windows. "I have never opened it," Tomas said quietly. "I have been its guardian for 15 years, waiting for someone else to follow the same path. Someone who would understand what Victor understood." He placed the envelope in her hands. "But I must warn you, Dr. Monroe. Every person who has pursued the Watchman too far has suffered. Not from any external danger, but from something much worse, the knowledge that some truths are too large for the human mind to contain." Lila held the envelope, feeling its weight. Inside, she knew, lay Victor's final conclusions about the Watchman, his ultimate understanding of what the mysterious figure represented. "The choice is yours," Tomas said. "But remember, once you read what he discovered, there is no going back to the comfortable ignorance of normal life. The Watchman, once seen, cannot be unseen." Outside, the Prague church bells began to toll, their ancient voices echoing through the city like a warning from the past. Lila returned to Oregon with Victor's unopened letter burning in her suitcase like a secret she wasn't ready to confront. The weight of Tomas's warnings echoed in her mind, but her academic curiosity proved stronger than her fear. She had come too far to turn back now. Her small house near the university felt different when she returned, smaller somehow, as if the world itself had shifted while she was away. She placed the letter on her kitchen table and stared at it for hours, wrestling with the decision that would change everything. That night, she dreamed of disasters. In her dream, she stood in the Raven Rock mine, watching the ceiling begin to crack. The miners worked around her, unaware of the danger, their picks striking stone in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. In the shadows, she could see him, the Watchman, standing perfectly still, his modern clothes somehow fitting naturally in the 1905 setting. She woke with a gasp, her sheets soaked in sweat. But the dream didn't fade as dreams usually did. Instead, it lingered with photographic clarity, as if her mind had been recording every detail. The dreams came every night after that, each one different but following the same pattern. She witnessed the San Francisco earthquake before the ground began to shake, saw the Welsh coal mine moments before the gas explosion, stood on the British Columbia Bridge as the first support beam began to groan under too much weight. And in every dream, the Watchman was there, watching. During the day, she tried to return to her normal routine, but concentration proved impossible. She would be examining a routine photograph when a face in the crowd would seem familiar, not just similar to someone she knew, but identical to faces from Victor's historical collection. A construction worker she passed on the street wore the same expression as a miner from the 1907 disaster. A waitress at her favorite cafe had the exact same smile as a factory worker from a 1903 photograph. The boundaries between past and present began to blur. 3 weeks after returning from Prague, she made the decision that would shatter her understanding of reality forever. She drove to the ruins of Raven Rock Mine. The site was now a state historical marker surrounded by forests that had reclaimed most of the mining infrastructure. A small parking area and interpretive trail led visitors through the remains of what had once been a bustling industrial operation. Lila had visited the site several times during her research, but it felt different now, charged with significance she couldn't explain. She followed the trail to where the main shaft had once descended into the earth. Now it was sealed with concrete and steel, marked with a plaque listing the names of the 40 men who had died in the collapse. She read through the names, recognizing several from the group photograph that had started her journey. As she stood there, memories of her dreams mixed with historical knowledge, creating a strange double vision of past and present. She could almost hear the sounds of the working mine, the clatter of equipment, the shouts of workers, the rumble of ore cars on narrow tracks. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought it was another waking dream, her exhausted mind playing tricks on her. But when she blinked and looked again, he was still there, standing about 50 yards away at the edge of the tree line, exactly as he appeared in every photograph. The Watchman. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the sealed mine shaft with that same knowing expression she had memorized from dozens of historical images. He stood perfectly still, as if he were posing for a camera that existed only in another time. Lila's heart hammered in her chest. This was her chance to confront him, to demand answers, to solve the mystery that had consumed her life. She took a step forward, then another, but something held her back. There was something in his stillness that suggested any approach would be futile, like trying to catch a reflection in water. Instead, she did what Victor had done decades before. She watched. For 10 minutes they stood in silent tableau, the historian and the eternal observer, separated by yards of space and perhaps centuries of time. She studied his face, his impossible clothing, the way the afternoon light seemed to bend around him without casting shadows. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, he was gone. Not walking away, not fading, simply absent, as if he had never been there at all. Lila drove home in a daze, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. When she reached her kitchen table, Victor's letter was still waiting where she had left it, but now she understood why Tomas had never opened it. Some knowledge was too dangerous to possess alone. But as night fell and the dreams began again, she realized she no longer had a choice. The watchman had shown himself to her in the present, just as he had appeared to Victor nearly a century ago. Whatever truth the letter contained, she was already too deep to turn back. With shaking fingers, she broke the seal and began to read Victor's final words. The letter was written in Victor's familiar careful script, but the handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the pages progressed, as if his hand had trembled with each revelation he recorded. Asterisk. March 10th, 1928. To whoever finds this letter, you have followed the same path I did. You have seen him in the photographs, felt the pull of the mystery, and now you stand where I stood, desperate for answers that may destroy you. I write this on my final night of research. Tomorrow, I will disappear from this world, not because I am in danger, but because I have learned something that makes it impossible to continue living among those who do not see. The watchman is not human. This much you have surely guessed. But he is not malevolent either, as I once feared. He is something far more disturbing. He is necessary. After months of investigation, I discovered the truth in the most unlikely place, an ancient monastery in the mountains of Romania, where monks have kept records dating back over 1,000 years. Brother Augustine, the eldest among them, showed me scrolls that spoke of the eternal witness, a being who appears at moments when the thread of time itself requires documentation. You see, my successor, time is not the flowing river we imagine it to be. It is more like a photograph itself, fixed, immutable, already developed. The disasters we think of as random tragedies are actually anchor points, moments that must occur exactly as they do for the fabric of reality to maintain its structure. The watchman does not cause these events. He does not prevent them. He witnesses them. He is there to ensure that what must happen, happens. His presence is the universe's way of recording the irreversible, moments so crucial to the timeline that they require an eternal observer to confirm their completion. This is why he appears identical in every photograph across decades. He exists outside our normal experience of time, stepping into our dimension only when history requires his testimony. The digital watch, the modern clothing, these are not anachronisms. They are evidence that he comes from a time beyond our understanding, a place where past and future exist simultaneously. But here is the most terrible truth, the one that has shattered my sanity and will shatter yours. Those who see him clearly are not chosen randomly. We are selected because we are somehow connected to the events he witnesses. I have discovered that my own grandfather died in the Welsh coal mine where I first photographed the watchman in 1890. The connection runs deeper than coincidence. It runs through blood, through fate, through threads of causality that our minds cannot fully comprehend. You, who read this letter, will find your own connection. Look into your family history, examine the dates and locations where the watchman has appeared. You will find the thread that binds you to him, and you will understand why you were chosen to see what others cannot. This knowledge comes with a price. Once you understand your connection to the watchman, you will begin to see the fixed nature of all events. Free will becomes an illusion when you realize that every choice, every tragedy, every moment of joy was predetermined eons ago. The weight of this understanding is what drives researchers like us to madness. I have spent these final weeks trying to find meaning in tragedy, particularly in the death of someone close to me, someone whose fate was sealed long before they were born. The Watchmen showed me that some moments in history are immovable, but witnessing them, understanding them, may be the only form of peace we can achieve. We cannot change what must happen, but we can bear witness to the truth that time itself needs someone to remember, someone to confirm that the irreversible has indeed occurred. I leave you with this: the Watchman is not your enemy. He is the cosmos's memory, the universe's way of keeping a record of its most crucial moments. Those of us who see him are not cursed. We are chosen to understand that suffering and joy, life and death, are all part of a larger pattern that requires witnesses. Do not try to find me. By the time you read this, I will have accepted my role in the pattern. The knowledge is too vast for one mind to contain alone, but it must be preserved. Hide this letter as I have hidden it, pass it to the next who follows our path. The Watchman watches us all, but some of us are called to watch back. Victor Cerny. Asterisk. Lila set down the letter with hands that shook uncontrollably. The room seemed to spin around her as Victor's words echoed in her mind. She thought of her father, finished in a mine collapse when she was 12 years old. She thought of her lifelong fascination with industrial disasters, her inexplicable draw to the forgotten tragedies of working-class America. The connection Victor had promised was there, staring her in the face with brutal clarity. Her father had died in the Copper Creek mine disaster of 1987. She had never connected it to her research because it was too recent, too personal, too painful. But now she understood why the Watchman had appeared to her, why she had been chosen to see what others missed. She was not just studying history, she was living it, connected by invisible threads to every tragedy the Watchman had witnessed across the centuries. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, as she finally understood the weight of what she carried. 5 years later, Dr. Lila Monroe stood before a lecture hall filled with eager graduate students, her graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, her eyes holding depths that hadn't been there before her journey began. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows as she clicked to the next slide in her presentation on historical anomalies and human perception. Throughout history, she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had seen beyond the veil of ordinary understanding, we find photographs and documents that challenge our assumptions about the past. Today, I want to discuss not just what we see in these images, but why we might be seeing it. The students leaned forward, notebooks ready. They had heard rumors about Professor Monroe's unconventional theories, her unusual collection of historical photographs, and her reputation for turning academic conferences into philosophical discussions about the nature of time and witness. She clicked to an image of the Raven Rock Mine Group photograph, but she had carefully cropped it to remove the background figure that had started her journey. Some truths she had learned were meant to be discovered gradually, by those who were ready to see them. This photograph was taken 3 weeks before the Raven Rock disaster of 1905. She continued, 40 men died in that collapse. When we look at their faces, these men who had no idea what was coming, what do we see? What responsibility do we have as witnesses to their stories? A student near the front raised her hand. Professor Monroe, do you think some events in history were inevitable? Like they had to happen exactly as they did? Lila paused, considering her words carefully. Over the years, she had learned to speak in parables rather than proclamations, to guide students toward questions rather than overwhelming them with impossible answers. That's a profound question, Sarah. I've come to believe that every moment in history serves a purpose we may not immediately understand. Our role as historians isn't always to judge or change the past, but sometimes simply to witness it, to ensure it's remembered with clarity and compassion. Her office door was always open after these lectures, and students often came to discuss the deeper implications of her teachings. She never mentioned the Watchman directly, never showed them the photographs that had changed her life. But occasionally, she would see something in a student's eyes, a particular intensity, a hunger for truth that went beyond academic curiosity, and she would quietly recommend certain archives, certain collections that might interest them. That evening, as she was packing her materials to leave, a sophomore named Marcus approached her desk. He held a manila folder against his chest with the protective grip of someone carrying something precious. "Professor Monroe," he said hesitantly, "I found something in my grandmother's attic that I thought might interest you. She passed away last month, and when I was going through her things, I found this photograph." Lila's heart began to beat faster, though she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of photograph, Marcus?" He opened the folder and withdrew a black and white image, placing it carefully on her desk. "It's from 1912, from a textile factory in Massachusetts. My great-great-grandfather worked there. The factory burned down a few days after this was taken. 15 people died." Lila looked down at the photograph and felt the familiar chill of recognition. There, in the background behind a group of seamstresses, stood the unmistakable figure of the watchman. Same pose, same expression, same impossible clothing that defied the laws of time. She looked up at Marcus and saw something that made her breath catch. His eyes held the same desperate curiosity that had driven her own obsession 5 years ago. The same need to understand, to find meaning in the inexplicable. "It's an interesting historical document," she said carefully, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "Have you noticed anything unusual about it?" Marcus nodded eagerly. "There's this figure in the background. He doesn't look like he belongs there. His clothes are wrong, and he appears to be wearing some kind of wristwatch. But that's impossible for 1912, right?" Lila smiled softly, the expression of someone who had found what she had been waiting for without knowing she was looking. She walked to her filing cabinet and withdrew a locked drawer, removing Victor's letter, now carefully preserved in a clear protective sleeve. "Marcus," she said, "I think you should know that you're not the first person to notice these kinds of anomalies. There's a history to this, a pattern that connects us all." She handed him the letter, watching as his eyes widened while reading Victor's name on the envelope. "This was written by a photojournalist in 1928. He discovered something extraordinary about figures like the one in your photograph. But I want you to understand, once you read this, once you truly see what it reveals, there's no going back to the comfortable simplicity of normal academic research." Marcus held the letter with trembling hands. "Will you help me understand it?" "Yes," Lila said, settling back into her chair. "But first, tell me about your family history. Tell me about the people who died in that factory fire. Because I suspect, Marcus, that you'll find your story is connected to theirs in ways you never imagined." Outside, the campus grew quiet as evening settled over the university. In her office, bathed in the warm glow of her desk lamp, Lila Monroe began to pass on the knowledge that Victor had entrusted to her, continuing the chain of witness that stretched back through decades of chosen souls who had learned to see time for what it really was. The watchman's work continued, and so did theirs, not to change what had been written in the fabric of existence, but to ensure that someone, somewhere, remembered the truth about the moments that mattered most.